Some truths do not vanish. They merely drift into the fog, waiting to be found again. Tonight's mystery begins in a silent railway yard at dawn, where forgotten engines stand like ghosts of journeys long ended, and one carriage holds the final echo of guilt, love, and vengeance intertwined. Where are you tuning in from, and what time is it? Let me know in the comments. The air is thick with secrets, my friend, and Holmes is already listening. Let's step into the fog and follow where it leads. It was one of those restless nights when the city seemed to hold its breath. The lamps outside our windows glimmered faintly through the fog, and the only sound was the ticking of the clock upon our mantel. I had laid aside my medical notes an hour earlier, yet sleep refused me. There was a curious heaviness in the air, a tension without cause. I had come to know such moods well in Baker Street. They were often the harbingers of strange events. Just as I began to drift toward uneasy slumber, the silence broke. A rapid clatter of hooves struck the cobblestones below, echoing sharply between the narrow houses. I rose and went to the window. Through the grey mist, I discerned a carriage, dark, gleaming and drawn by a single horse, halting at our door. A moment later came the violent knocking, 3 urgent blows that resounded through the stairwell. I heard Holmes stir in the adjoining room. The familiar scrape of his chair, the rustle of papers, and the deliberate strike of a match, all as calm as if the hour were noon. I descended just as Mrs. Hudson's startled exclamation was stifled by the opening of the door. Upon the threshold stood a gentleman whose pallor and trembling betrayed both fear and exhaustion. His coat was spattered with mud, his gloves half torn, and his eyes, bloodshot with sleeplessness, darted about as if expecting pursuit. "For God's sake," he gasped, "is Mr. Holmes within? I beg of you. It is a matter of life, of honour, perhaps even of murder." Before I could answer, Holmes himself appeared behind me, his dressing gown neatly buttoned, his expression composed, and his gaze fixed on our unexpected visitor. "Come in, sir," said he. "You have chosen your hour with precision. The night is long, and we are awake." The man entered with a nervous glance behind him, as though the fog might conceal something dreadful. Holmes motioned him to a chair by the fire, where the light softened his distress, but revealed every detail to Holmes's practiced eye. "Pray compose yourself," said my friend gently, settling opposite him. "You have driven here in haste, I see, yet the road was not kind to your horses. Tell me, did you come from the west?" The stranger started, as if struck by sorcery. "Yes, from Reading," he stammered. "How could you possibly—" "The clay upon your cuffs," Holmes murmured, "is peculiar to that district, but let us not linger upon trifles. I perceive that you are Sir Henry Alcroft of Alcroft Hall. The papers recently mentioned your return from abroad. Am I correct?" "You are, sir," said he, astonishment deepening into awe. "Then I need not waste words. My wife, Lady Eveline, is gone, vanished, utterly, between Reading and London." Holmes inclined his head, the faintest glimmer of interest in his grey eyes. "Gone?" he repeated. "You mean she left the train?" "I mean," Sir Henry said hoarsely, "that she was in our private compartment when we departed, and when we arrived at Paddington, she was not. The door was locked from within, the window unforced, and yet she was gone, as though the air itself had swallowed her." I felt a chill despite the warmth of the fire. Holmes steepled his fingers beneath his chin, his face expressionless. "You have spoken of impossibility," he said. "That is always where inquiry should begin. Tell me, Sir Henry, everything." What followed was an account as extraordinary as any I had heard within those walls. Sir Henry described their journey from the countryside. His wife seated opposite him, pale yet composed, her eyes fixed upon the window's reflection of passing lights. At one point she had raised her veil, murmured something about the air, and turned away. When the train halted at Paddington, he found the door still locked and the compartment empty. The guard had seen no one descend. No passenger had occupied the neighbouring carriage. There was no trace, not a scream, not a sign of struggle, only her travelling cloak folded neatly upon the seat beside him. When he finished, His voice sank to a whisper. "You see, Mr. Holmes, why I fear madness. There is no rational explanation." Holmes rose, poured our visitor a measure of brandy, and spoke with that quiet authority which never failed to restore confidence. "You are mistaken, Sir Henry. There is always a rational explanation. The difficulty lies only in tracing the thread." He began to question him with the precision of a surgeon. The hour of departure, the number of stations passed, the disposition of luggage, even the colour of the compartment's upholstery. I marvelled at the patience of his inquiry, which moved from the smallest point of observation to the grander question of motive. At length, he leaned back, his gaze half abstracted. "One inconsistency troubles me," he said. "You claim your wife's mood was composed, yet you speak of unease. Which was it?" Sir Henry hesitated. "She was silent," he admitted. "Perhaps fearful. We had spoken little of late." Holmes nodded slightly. "I thought as much. Grief often follows silence more faithfully than words. You will do well, Sir Henry, to leave the remainder to me." He rose, took his cloak from the stand, and turned toward the door. "Watson," said he, "we shall examine this carriage at first light. The night will not be wasted if we walk." Within minutes, we were once more in the street. The dawn had not yet broken, and the fog lay thick upon London. Somewhere in the distance, a bell tolled the hour of 2. As we passed the waiting carriage that had borne our client, I glanced back to see Sir Henry Alcroft still upon the steps of Baker Street, a lonely figure swallowed by mist and by mystery. Sir Henry Alcroft sat opposite us in the gas-lit stillness of Baker Street, his gloved hands folded upon his knee, the very image of composure. Yet even from my chair beside the hearth, I could see the tremor that ran, almost imperceptibly, along his wrist each time he raised it to his brow. His attire was immaculate, his speech measured, his bearing that of a man born to dignity. But there was a tension about the eyes which betrayed nights of unbroken anxiety. I have seen courage in many forms, on battlefields and in sick rooms, but never have I seen a face that struggled more visibly between grief and self-command. Holmes regarded him with that courteous detachment which so often encouraged confidence in those who sought his aid. "You are fatigued, Sir Henry," he said softly. "Pray begin at whatever point seems least painful to you. A clear sequence will serve us better than haste." The nobleman inclined his head. "It was yesterday evening, Mr. Holmes. We left Reading by the 8:20 express. My wife and I occupied a compartment reserved for 2. We had dined early. She complained of a faintness, but insisted upon travelling. There was little conversation between us. She appeared preoccupied, and I, fool that I am, allowed her silence to remain unbroken." He paused, as though the rhythm of the remembered train still sounded in his ears. Outside, the country was a blur of lamps and hedgerows. Inside, only the dull beat of the wheels and the reflection of our faces in the glass. She had drawn her veil, and once, only once, did she lift it to look directly at me. There was no anger in her expression, only a sort of resignation I cannot explain. Holmes leaned forward slightly, and from that moment until we reached Paddington, Sir Henry continued, I read a newspaper by the dim lamp above us. When the train slowed, I rose, replaced my gloves, and turned to assist her. She was gone. The door was still locked, the window fastened. The guard swore he had seen no lady alight along the line. In less than an hour she had vanished from a space scarcely 6 feet square. A long silence followed. The fire crackled softly. The clock struck the quarter. Holmes's voice broke the pause with its familiar precision. "The seating, Sir Henry. Was it opposite or beside you?" "Opposite." "And the lamp, bright enough to see her reflection?" "Yes, though the light flickered." Holmes's fingers steepled beneath his chin. "You will forgive the minuteness of my questions. It is upon trifles that the weight of truth so often rests. At what instant did you last perceive her? Reflection?" "I cannot say exactly," Sir Henry admitted. Perhaps between Slough and Ealing, I remember glancing up and finding only my own face in the glass. Holmes nodded gravely. The guard's corridor, was it adjacent to your compartment? A flicker passed across the man's expression, swift as the shadow of a cloud. Yes, he said after a pause, though I scarcely noticed it. I saw Holmes's keen eyes rest upon that hesitation as a falcon fixes upon motion in the grass. Yet his tone remained gentle. Quite so. You were absorbed in your reading. One last point. Your wife's personal effects? Her cloak lay beside me when we arrived. I have here a glove that fell upon the floor. He drew it from his pocket, a delicate article of cream kid, faintly scented with lavender. Holmes took it between finger and thumb, his nostrils dilating ever so slightly. For an instant he said nothing. Then, replacing it with care upon the table, he rose. "Watson," said he, "there is a train to Reading at 7:15. We shall see this carriage for ourselves. Sir Henry, go home, and rest if you can. Truth travels quickly when the wheels are properly set upon the rails." Our visitor pressed his hat to his breast, murmured a word of thanks, and departed as silently as he had come. The fog had thickened outside, muffling the sound of his retreating steps. Holmes stood for a moment, gazing into the fire, then reached for his cloak. "Another locked room, Watson," he murmured. "Only this one moves upon iron wheels." And together we stepped once more into the London night. The morning broke sullen and grey as we made our way through the drizzle toward Paddington station. The gas lamps along Praed Street burned faintly against the persistent mist, and the air carried that mingled odour of damp stone, coal smoke and far-off steam that seems to belong exclusively to London's waking hours. Holmes walked a pace ahead of me, his collar turned up and his stick swinging idly from his fingers. To an onlooker, he might have appeared a man on some trivial errand, yet I knew well that beneath that calm exterior, his mind was already tracing invisible lines through the puzzle laid before us. The station yard was near deserted at that hour, save for a few porters in mufflers and an occasional watchman shuffling along the platform. The vast iron arches overhead disappeared into a drifting pall of vapour, and the intermittent hiss of engines lent the scene an air of spectral unease. Holmes paused at the entrance, took one long breath, and remarked, "The smell of London, Watson, half machinery, half mystery." Waiting near the signal box was Inspector Lestrade, his shoulders hunched, an expression unmistakably sour. He saluted us curtly, his patience clearly worn thin by the early hour. "Another of your romantic inquiries, Mr. Holmes," said he. "I've seen the compartment myself, locked tight as a miser's chest. A lady vanishes. Her husband wrings his hands, and Scotland Yard is expected to unearth miracles. I dare say she's eloped, as women sometimes do, with a man less tedious than her spouse." Holmes regarded him mildly, as though listening to the weather rather than words. "It is possible, of course," he said, "but improbable, unless elopements are now conducted through sealed doors." Lestrade's lips pressed into a grim line. "I'm a practical man, Mr. Holmes. Locked doors don't vanish women. Either she walked out, or she never existed." Holmes's grey eyes brightened for a moment. "An admirable creed, Inspector. Reality or illusion, no middle ground. And yet," he added softly, "most crimes are committed precisely in that middle ground." He moved toward the waiting carriage without another word. Lestrade followed with reluctant curiosity, and I, notebook in hand, brought up the rear. The compartment in question stood detached upon a siding, glistening faintly with dew. Holmes examined the handle, the bolts, and the metal edge of the door with the delicacy of a surgeon handling an instrument. "Still locked from within," he murmured. "Good. A clue that refuses to vanish is rarer than a truthful witness." Inside, the carriage was as neat as any I had seen. 2 facing benches upholstered in green velvet, a small rack overhead, and the faint sheen of recent cleaning upon the brass fixtures. The air was close and carried a stale odour of perfume mingled with damp cloth. I confess to feeling a shudder of unease, for the very orderliness of the place seemed to mock the horror it concealed. Holmes's gaze travelled from the door latch to the floor. His eyes, always quicker than mine, halted upon something near the far corner. "You see it, Watson." Following his direction, I noticed for the first time a single glove lying between the seats. A delicate article of lace and kid, torn slightly at the wrist. I stooped to retrieve it. "Her ladyship's, no doubt," said I. Holmes took it from my hand, holding it up to the light. "No doubt. But do you observe the dust along the fingertips? It did not fall. It was placed. Whoever dropped it meant it to be found." Lestrade gave a snort. "A sentimental token, that's all. The woman likely flung it aside before stepping off." "Yet she could not have stepped off," Holmes replied evenly, "without the cooperation of wood, iron, and gravity, all of which remain stubbornly loyal to their duties." He turned next to the velvet bench opposite the door. Bending low, he passed his long fingers lightly over the cushion, then knelt to peer at it from the side. "Note, Watson, the depression here, shallow, irregular, but distinct. A second occupant, heavy enough to sink the padding for but a moment. And there, a faint smear of ash, not cigar, but lamp wick. Someone sat here in darkness, waiting." Lestrade's frown deepened. "A passenger, perhaps before them." Holmes shook his head. "The dust line tells otherwise. It is newly made." He rose, dusted his knees, and sniffed the air with a faint motion of distaste. And the perfume, unmistakable. Indeed, as he spoke, a delicate fragrance seemed to drift upon the stale air. Lavender, but of a richness unfamiliar to me. "You recognize it?" I asked. "French. Lavande de Beauvais, if I am not mistaken. A brand obtainable only in 1 or 2 London establishments. Its presence here is most instructive. A fragrance, Watson, is a confession in vapour form." He said no more but stood very still, his gaze upon the opposite wall, lost in silent reasoning. After a minute he spoke again, quietly. "There has been no violence," he said. "No theft, no outcry. What happened here was done with deliberation, and I think, with fear. A bloodless crime, yet no less grave for its cleanliness. The lady did not vanish. She was removed, with consent or coercion. Which it was, we shall learn. But I tell you this, my dear Lestrade. What has disappeared from this compartment is not merely a woman, but a truth long buried beneath gentility." Holmes drew his gloves tighter, as though sealing his thoughts within. "Come, Watson," he said. "Our next task lies where iron meets flesh, among those who made this train move." And with that, we left the dim carriage, the faint scent of lavender following us out into the misty dawn. The fog had thickened by morning, curling low along the gutters as we made our way through the quiet lanes behind Marylebone Road. The faint clatter of hooves echoed ahead, guiding us toward the mews Holmes had traced from the records of the cab company. It was a modest yard, hemmed in by brick walls, its cobbles slick with rain and a faint odour of hay and oil mingling in the air. 2 horses shifted restlessly in their stalls, stamping at the stones as though impatient with secrets they could not speak. Holmes's sharp eyes roved over each detail, the damp harnesses, the uneven prints of wheels leading in from the street, the still warm lanterns. "Recently returned," he murmured. "And in haste. Observe, Watson, the right wheel bears the imprint of silt rather than street mud." Before I could reply, a door creaked open and a lean, nervous-looking man emerged. His shoulders were hunched beneath a frayed coat, and he twisted his hat in both hands with a fidgeting motion that betrayed his agitation. Holmes stepped forward with his usual composed courtesy. "Mr. Briggs, I believe," he said. "Your stablemaster informed me that this was your post. We have no wish to trouble you beyond what the truth already has." The man looked up sharply, his watery eyes darting between us. "Yes, sir. Briggs it is. I don't know that I can help much, Mr. Holmes. It was only a fare like any other." "Indeed." Holmes's voice was smooth, almost kind. A fare for Sir Henry Alcroft, whose wife has disappeared. At the mention of the name, Briggs's grip upon his hat tightened until the brim bent. I heard of it in the papers," he stammered. "A terrible thing, sir. But I only drove the gentleman that night, no more than an hour or so." Holmes's expression did not change. "Let us be precise, Mr. Briggs. You were engaged to wait outside the Alcroft residence." "Yes, sir. Near 10:30 it was. The butler called me down from the stand and said his master would require me shortly." He paused, licking his lips. "I waited till midnight, near enough. Then the butler came again, said Sir Henry was not going out after all, and I might go home." There was something rehearsed in the speech, a rhythm too neat for truth. Holmes regarded him gently, his head inclined. "Midnight, you say, and the butler paid you?" The man hesitated. Not the butler, sir. A servant, I think. Couldn't rightly see in the dark." "Ah, yes," Holmes said, his tone no more than a whisper of amusement. "A servant's servant, perhaps. They multiply like reflections in a mirror. Tell me, did this mysterious subordinate speak with a foreign accent?" "I don't rightly recall," Briggs muttered. "It were quick business, sir. I took the coin and went." As he spoke, I saw him glance furtively toward the mouth of the alley. Twice, then thrice, his eyes darted there, as though expecting someone to appear from the fog. The movement was so unconscious, so filled with apprehension, that even I could not mistake it. Holmes, meanwhile, appeared entirely absorbed in adjusting his glove. "Strange," my friend murmured at last, crouching beside the wheel of the coach. "This mud upon the rim, quite out of place for Mayfair. You have been near the river, Mr. Briggs, and recently." The coachman's mouth fell open. "The river, sir? No, sir, not I." Holmes rose, brushing his hands. "Ah, but it is clear. This fine pale clay, mixed with reed ash and oil scum, is peculiar to the embankment. You see, Watson, it yields the colour of dull pewter when dried. An honest cab wheel will rarely wear such a coat unless it has stood some hours beside the Thames." Briggs swallowed hard, his complexion turning the shade of tallow. "I only follow orders, sir," he blurted. "I was told to wait, that's all. I've done no harm." "None that I can prove," Holmes replied softly. He drew a coin from his waistcoat and pressed it into the man's trembling palm. "You have earned this, for your candour and your fear. The latter, I assure you, was the more convincing." The driver made a hasty bow, muttered his thanks, and disappeared into the fog, his steps quick and uncertain. Holmes watched him go, the faintest smile ghosting across his lips. "You observed his relief, Watson. A man may lie for many reasons: avarice, loyalty, or terror. This one, I think, for the last. He deceives us, but not for himself. Someone holds the reins tighter than he ever held those horses." He turned toward the waiting street, his cloak stirring faintly in the wind. "Come, my dear fellow. The river calls again, and as always, it knows more than men will tell." The morning had grown pale and grey when Holmes halted abruptly upon the embankment, his keen eyes fixed upon a patch of darker fabric lodged between the stones near the river's edge. The wind carried with it the faint brine of the Thames, mingled with a sharper scent of decay from the mudflats below. Holmes stooped and drew out a cloak, its hem sodden with mist and grit. He shook it lightly, examining the stitching with swift precision. "Foreign workmanship," he murmured. "Note the thread, Watson, silk of Turkish weave, and see how the lining bears the faint impression of a crest, though deliberately torn away. A woman's garment, yet too fine for travel, too coarse for the theatre." He turned the collar toward the light, where droplets glistened faintly upon the fabric. "Damp, but not soaked. This cloak has lain here but a few hours. The wearer came to the river, willingly, I suspect, and did not return by this path." A faint trail of prints led away from the spot, visible only to the most discerning eye. Holmes followed them without hesitation, stepping lightly over the uneven stones. I brought up the rear, my boots sinking into the pliant mud. "The river keeps its confidences," he said over his shoulder, "but not from those who listen closely." We followed the faint impressions where the ground sloped toward a cluster of willows. The air was still and heavy, even the gulls circled in silence. Through the tangled reeds, a narrow footpath wound along the bank, nearly lost beneath the growth of grass and moss. At its end, half concealed by drooping boughs, stood a small boathouse, its roof sagging, its timbers green with neglect. A faded sign, long illegible, hung crookedly by one rusted hinge. Holmes paused a few yards off, surveying it with that measured calm which often preceded his most incisive action. "Observe the padlock, Watson, not the work of a trespasser. This bolt was secured from within." He rapped upon the door. The hollow sound returned no answer, save the echo of water lapping beneath the boards. After a brief inspection of the hinges and frame, he circled to the side, where a narrow window hung slightly ajar. Within moments, he had eased it open and slipped inside with the agility of a man half his years. I followed with less grace, but equal curiosity. The interior was dim, save for a faint crimson glow emanating from a small iron grate. Holmes bent low before it, stirring the ash delicately with his stick. Among the dying embers, the half-charred fragments of a letter curled and crumbled at his touch. One corner remained intact, bearing the graceful inscription, "Eveline." He turned it gently toward me. "A name can outlive fire," said he. "But a letter, Watson, must have been written to someone, to whom that is the ghost that lingers here." My gaze travelled about the cramped room. A woman's handkerchief lay upon the table beside a small bottle of perfume, the label worn but legible, Lavande de Beauvais. A cracked mirror leaned upon the sill, reflecting a distorted patch of light from the grate. Holmes's eyes moved over each object with minute attention. "These were placed, not left," he observed. "Note the symmetry: handkerchief, bottle, mirror. She wished to leave a message, though not in words. Reflection, fragrance, and farewell. Symbols of identity and erasure. Curious." He crossed to a small writing desk in the corner. Its drawers had been emptied, save one, where a thin ledger lay open beneath a film of dust. He brushed it clean with his sleeve and smiled faintly. "Here, Watson, the true occupant of this place reveals himself. Reginald Alcroft, dated the very night of the lady's disappearance. The cousin's name, if you recall, was spoken with hesitation by Sir Henry." I felt a chill run through me. "Then she came here willingly?" "Or fearfully," Holmes replied. "The ledger proves only presence, not purpose." He replaced it carefully, closing the desk with a quiet click. Outside, the river lapped against the timbers, a slow and mournful sound. Holmes stood at the threshold, his eyes following the mist as it drifted across the water. "The Alcrofts," he said softly, "seem to have built their lineage as the river builds its banks, layer upon layer of silt and secrecy. Yet the same tide that conceals also reveals. Remember that, Watson. In matters of family, rescue and betrayal are but reflections of the same face." And with that, he turned from the boathouse, the scent of lavender and ash lingering behind us like the memory of a confession never spoken. It was late in the afternoon when Holmes, seated in his armchair with the newspaper folded neatly upon his knee, turned to me with that air of quiet concentration which usually signalled the inception of a new line of inquiry. The room was heavy with the smoke of his cigarette, and yet, amid that pall of tobacco, the faint aroma of lavender still lingered, the same elusive fragrance that had clung to the compartment on the Paddington Express. "Watson," said he, "fragrance is but memory made visible to the senses. Even air, if properly questioned, will confess its secrets. I would have you trace this particular perfume, its source, its rarity, and, if fortune favours us, the hand that dispensed it. Even fragrance, my dear fellow, may leave a fingerprint upon the air." He handed me the glove from Sir Henry's case, still faintly scented, despite the days passed since our discovery. I slipped it into my pocket and set out at once, filled with that peculiar mixture of duty and curiosity which Holmes's errands invariably inspired. Bond Street was alive with the quiet bustle of late shoppers and carriages, though the wind carried with it a chill foretelling rain. After some inquiry among the assistants of the larger establishments, I was directed to a narrow shop whose discreet facade bore a gilded sign reading Maison Rue Annecy. Within, the air was heady with mingled essences of jasmine, violet and ambergris, a sort of olfactory tapestry that seemed to suspend time itself. The proprietor, a courteous Frenchman with the most delicate of manners, came forward at my request. I produced the glove, and he bent over it as a priest might over a relic. "Ah, monsieur," he murmured, inhaling deeply, "this is no common scent. It is parfum de l'Anjou, a creation most exclusive, and, if I may say so, one of our triumphs. Very costly, very discreet. Few ladies in London can claim it." "Few," I repeated. "And might one of them be Lady Eveline Alcroft?" At this, his eyes brightened with recognition. "Indeed, yes, monsieur. A charming lady, gracious, refined, always precise in her taste. She purchased a bottle but a week ago. I remember well, for she was not alone." He reached beneath the counter and withdrew a thick ledger bound in calfskin. Turning through the neat columns of purchases, he placed his finger upon a line written in elegant copperplate. There it was, Lady Eveline Alcroft, Parfum de l'Anjou, 1 flacon. And beside it, in smaller script, accompanied by another lady, veiled. "You are certain of this?" I asked. "As certain as I am of the air I breathe, monsieur." The second lady spoke little. Her manner was assured, but her gestures, how shall I say, a touch too deliberate, too cautious. I have served women of all ranks, and one learns to discern artifice even through a veil. I pressed him for further detail. He frowned, searching his recollection. "The voice," he said slowly, "was low, unusually so, and had a weight of careful modulation. It was not merely soft, it was trained. Ah, but there was something else. When she reached for her purse, I saw that her gloves were of mourning black, yet too new, as though bought for disguise rather than sorrow." His words lingered with me as I left the perfumery. The air outside, sharp and cold, seemed a relief after the suffocating sweetness of that scented chamber. By the time I returned to Baker Street, the fog had rolled in thickly from the river, dimming the lamps and muffling the clatter of hooves upon the street. Holmes listened intently as I relayed my findings. He took the glove from me and laid it beside the small vial we had recovered from the boathouse. "Observe," he said, "the label, worn at the edge by recent handling, the cord frayed as though it had been untied and reknotted more than once. And yet the scent is the same. Tell me, Watson, what conclusion does that suggest to you?" "That both bottles belong to Lady Eveline." He shook his head with a faint smile. "No, my dear fellow, that one did not. Deception begins in the smallest details, in a name, a signature, or even a fragrance. When a woman wears another's perfume, it is not vanity, but intent. Here, the perfume is the disguise. A scent, after all, can travel where the face cannot." He rose and stood by the window, the fog curling beyond the glass like smoke from an unseen fire. "There is a certain poetry in it, is there not? To vanish beneath the veil of another's essence. But poetry, Watson, is rarely innocent." I sat back, reflecting on the strange tangle of facts. The glove, the perfume, the veiled companion. Each spoke of intimacy and imitation, as though Lady Eveline had been shadowed by a reflection of herself. And as I watched Holmes's profile against the lamplight, it struck me that the air of our little room had grown thick with that same fragrance, sweet, elegant, and suffocatingly persistent. "Holmes," I said at last, "the scent remains." He turned, his expression unreadable. "Yes, Watson," he murmured, as do lies. Both fade only when the truth has found its breath. Bloomsbury has ever struck me as a district where the air seems thicker with memory than with life itself. Its houses, grave and respectable, wear the dust of contemplation upon their stones. On that sombre afternoon, as Holmes and I turned into Guildford Street, I could not help but feel that we walked not merely into another quarter of London, but into a place where time itself lingered, unwilling to pass. The house we sought stood midway along the terrace, a narrow dwelling smothered by ivy, its shutters half drawn though the day was mild. The faint rustle of leaves against the window panes lent a whispering tone to the silence. Holmes regarded it with the same detached curiosity with which he might have examined a specimen under glass. "Observe, Watson," he murmured. "Nature conspires here with secrecy. Even ivy knows when to cover shame." The servant who admitted us spoke in hushed tones and vanished as though relieved to escape the atmosphere within. Mrs. Tarrant awaited us in a small parlour where the light seemed reluctant to linger. She rose as we entered, a woman of indeterminate age, draped in mourning lace that appeared less a tribute to the dead than an armour against the living. Her hands, slender and pale, trembled only when unobserved. "I trust I do not inconvenience you, madam," Holmes began courteously. "We come not as intruders, but as seekers of truth regarding a mutual acquaintance, Lady Eveline Alcroft." The widow inclined her head with brittle grace. "I knew her once," she said, her tone cool but deliberate. "Long ago, in youth, when truth and loyalty are but delicate illusions. Pray be seated, gentlemen." Her composure was remarkable, each word chosen as though weighed upon invisible scales. Yet beneath that polished exterior, I sensed the faintest vibration of emotion, the echo of some old wound never quite closed. Holmes, who perceived such tremors as readily as a barometer senses change, observed her with quiet attention. "You speak of youth, Mrs. Tarrant," he said lightly. "It must have been a friendship of some intimacy for the memory to remain so vivid." Her eyes flickered toward him, dark with something that was not quite anger. "Intimacy," she repeated. "We shared laughter, and later, distance. Lady Eveline was of a temperament that drew warmth from others, yet returned little. She was admired by many, loved, perhaps, by too many. I do not claim exception." She paused, her voice softening almost against her will. "There were summers at her father's estate, rides at dawn, music in the evenings. I remember her laughter echoing across the lawns. Yet even then I saw what others missed. She envied gentleness because she could not feign it long." Holmes's tone remained conversational. "And yet you kept in correspondence?" "For a time," she admitted, her fingers tightening upon the arm of her chair, "until life divided us. Her marriage, you understand, was no surprise to me. She was always destined to grasp what lay just beyond her reach." It was at that instant that Holmes, feigning an idle turn of thought, remarked, "The Alcroft estate is said to be most generous, both in fortune and in obligation. Sir Henry appears to possess a rare talent for extending his prosperity to those who have earned his goodwill." The effect was immediate. The widow's poise faltered, a shadow passing across her face. "Yes," she said after a pause that lingered too long. "He has been kind. I receive a modest allowance through the Alcroft Trust, an old arrangement of Sir Henry's late father. It means little." Holmes inclined his head slightly. "To those of independence, very little indeed. And yet gratitude has its way of revealing where memory does not." Something in his tone pierced the veil of her restraint. Her lips parted, and a faint flush rose beneath the pallor of her skin. "Gratitude," she said bitterly. "Do you think I asked for charity? Eveline took what was never hers, the affection of a man whose heart was once mine. She knew it, and smiled upon me as she accepted his name. Even the years have not cleansed that theft." Her voice broke upon the last word, and for a moment she seemed unaware of our presence. Then, as though ashamed of her outburst, She drew herself upright once more, her features frozen into calm. "Forgive me. The past is a treacherous guest." Holmes's manner remained gentle, and yet it seldom leaves without a farewell. "You corresponded with her, Mrs. Tarrant. Perhaps until recently." She hesitated. "A letter or two, perhaps. She wrote last month, a brief note, little more than civility. But I could read what she dared not write. Pride, Mr. Holmes, has a voice all its own, and I heard it. She feared exposure, not of a crime, but of her own folly. And pride, you know, invites ruin more readily than sin." For a long moment, Holmes regarded her in silence. I thought I saw in his expression a glimmer of something softer than intellect, perhaps understanding, even pity. At last he rose, and I followed his example. Outside the air was sharp, the sky heavy with the promise of rain. Holmes lit his pipe and walked a few paces before speaking. "Watson," he said at length, "when intellect meets envy, it is the latter that betrays itself first. One may conceal guilt from justice, but never from compassion. Pity, my dear fellow, is the keenest of magnifying glasses." And as we turned back toward Bloomsbury Square, I could still smell upon my coat the faint trace of lavender that had hung in that suffocating room, a sweetness that clung too long, like the memory of love turned to resentment. It was scarcely light when the sharp trill of the telegram bell broke the silence of Baker Street. Holmes, who had not yet retired, rose from his armchair with the alacrity of one who hears his own thoughts confirmed by circumstance. The message, handed to me still crumpled from his impatient grasp, bore the superintendent's seal of the Great Western Railway. Its few words were stark and urgent. "Missing compartment located. Disused siding by Thames, near Battersea Bridge. Request your presence immediately." Holmes's eyes gleamed with that cold brilliance I had come to know so well. "The carriage returns, Watson," said he, "and like certain consciences, it appears to have drifted toward confession. Quick, your coat. The dawn will not wait, nor will the river." By the time our cab drew near the river embankment, a thin mist had settled over the line of sidings like a burial shroud. The air smelled of wet iron and distant smoke. The lamps of the station glowed faintly through the haze. There, upon an isolated length of track, stood the missing compartment, spectral, still, and solitary. Its paint, once a rich maroon, was now streaked with the dull sheen of moisture. Beads of dew clung to the brass fixtures like tears. Even Lestrade, who awaited us with his coat buttoned high against the morning chill, seemed subdued by the scene. "There she is, Mr. Holmes," he muttered, "turned up like a ghost out of the fog. No sign who moved her, nor how." Holmes's gaze swept over the carriage, resting upon the wheels. Mud upon the treads. Fresh, but not from these grounds. And see how it cakes unevenly, as though the carriage had been drawn through shallow water. The river lends and takes, Lestrade, but it does not forget where it has been. He advanced to the door, examined the lock, and with a deft motion of his knife, sprung the latch. The hinges groaned faintly as the door yielded. The air that escaped was close and damp, tinged with something faintly metallic, not blood, but the echo of it. Holmes inhaled deeply, his nostrils flaring. "The scent of the river," he murmured. "And decay not yet old. Step carefully, Watson." Within, the compartment bore the appearance of disturbance masked by hasty order. The cushions were brushed but not fluffed, the rug straightened though still stained with damp. Holmes's keen eyes roamed over every inch. Presently, he stooped beside the left-hand bench and ran a finger beneath the wooden frame. When he withdrew it, it was coated with a fine layer of silt, that peculiar pale grey mud that only the Thames yields at low tide. "Note this," said he, "and beneath it, yes, a thread of fabric, pale, feminine, and torn by pressure rather than by scissors. The carriage was submerged partially, Watson, perhaps for concealment or delay. Whoever placed it there meant for it to be found, but not too soon. He straightened and turned his attention toward the window. Something lodged here. With careful pressure, he drew from the narrow crevice a small rectangle of torn paper, the corner of a photograph. The edges were water-warped, the surface streaked with moisture, yet the image upon it was unmistakable. Two women, seated side by side, both dressed in fine attire of recent fashion. One face, though blurred, bore the unmistakable features of Lady Eveline Allcroft. The other, partially obscured by the tear that severed the photograph diagonally, was that of a woman unknown to me. Holmes studied it long, turning it in the light. "A curious division," he murmured. "Observe how the tear passes precisely between the two figures, as though by intention rather than accident. The gesture of someone who wished to separate what life had once joined," I ventured. "Then the second woman is not her murderer, but her mirror," he interrupted softly. "Friendship and envy, Watson, the twin faces of affection. One fades when the other thrives. You see here the evidence of both." He replaced the fragment in his pocketbook and glanced once more about the compartment. "We have seen the river's handiwork and the survivor's silence. Between them lies truth, drowned, but not dead. This was no mere flight, but a substitution. One woman vanished, another took her place, long enough to deceive a husband, a guard, and perhaps even the law." As he stepped out into the chill air, the first train of morning came roaring down the main line, the rush of its passing scattering the mist in trembling waves. Holmes stood unmoving, his gaze fixed upon the pale sky above the river's bend. "What began as disappearance," he said quietly, "now reeks of remorse. The river carried her secret to the shore, not out of pity, but inevitability. Water reflects, Watson, but it also remembers." And with that, he turned from the carriage, his coat catching the dawn breeze, while I followed in silence, the echo of steel upon steel still ringing faintly behind us, like the lingering guilt of the living. The morning had broken pale and uncertain, the kind of London dawn that lends an air of melancholy even to the most industrious hour. Holmes had secured the cooperation of the railway superintendent and Inspector Lestrade, and by 8 o'clock the group of us stood assembled upon the platform at Paddington. The station was half awake, clerks with notebooks, a handful of curious porters, and the inevitable handful of idlers drawn by rumour. Holmes alone appeared perfectly composed, his eyes alight with that restless concentration which to him was a substitute for emotion. "My friends," he said quietly, "we are not here to perform a spectacle, but to reenact a truth that has been waiting, patient as conscience, to be seen. Every object, every motion, must match its original counterpart. Only thus may the illusion be dispelled." The superintendent inclined his head gravely. Lestrade muttered something about theatrical business, but Holmes took no notice. He gestured toward the waiting compartment, the same carriage that had vanished and returned from the Thames's shadow. Its brass gleamed, its panels freshly scrubbed, though to me it still seemed haunted by the memory of that silent night. Within the compartment, Holmes bent to his task with the deliberation of a craftsman. "Let us restore the stage as it was left to us," said he. Upon the seat he laid the single glove, pale, delicate, and faintly perfumed. The torn photograph he wedged once more behind the frame of the window. From his pocket he drew a small vial of lavender essence and let fall a drop upon the rug. The air, almost at once, seemed filled with that subtle sweetness, the same elusive trace that had lingered between the shadows of truth and deceit. "You see, Watson," he remarked, "evidence is not merely found, it must be made to speak. The glove tells of presence, the perfume of identity, the photograph of connection, yet each in its way was a lie. Our task is to let them contradict one another." Lestrade frowned. "You mean to say, Mr. Holmes, that all this trifling scent and finery amounts to proof of murder?" Holmes smiled faintly. Trifles, my dear Lestrade, are the logic of crime. The great acts of passion are seldom concealed by great devices. It is the small inconsistencies that proclaim the truth. He now directed the railway guard, a broad-shouldered man with a soot-blackened cap, to demonstrate the narrow passage running alongside the carriages, a corridor scarcely wide enough for a single man to pass. "Observe, Watson," said Holmes as the guard stepped within. "This serviceway, though hidden from the passengers, permits movement from one compartment to the next, provided one knows its mechanism." With a deft motion, Holmes pressed a concealed latch near the hinge of the door. To my astonishment, the inner panel gave slightly, enough to reveal the thin strip of the corridor beyond. "A design for efficiency," Holmes explained, "but also an invitation to deceit. Through this, one could enter or depart unseen, provided the doors to the carriage were already secured from within." The superintendent's brows rose. "Then you suggest, sir, that the lady was removed in this manner?" "Not removed," said Holmes softly. "Exchanged." He now set in motion the experiment itself. The guard took his place in the adjoining car, while a railway maid, veiled and silent, was seated beside the glove and photograph. At Holmes's signal, the train began its slow movement along the line, a mere mimicry of travel, yet in that rhythmic motion one could almost hear the pulse of the original crime. At the 3rd minute, precisely timed by Holmes's watch, he called, "Now!" The hidden latch clicked, the passage darkened for a breath, and when Holmes reopened the door, the woman within was gone. In her place sat another, similarly, veiled, motionless, save for the trembling of her gloved hands. Holmes turned to the stunned onlookers. "Gentlemen, you have witnessed the silent substitution, the exchange by which Lady Eveline Alcroft's body was carried from this compartment, and another woman seated in her stead. The illusion was perfect. When the train reached Paddington, the compartment was locked, the husband deceived, and the true crime hidden beneath a veil of grief." Lestrade's voice faltered. "Then, it was murder after all?" Holmes inclined his head gravely. "Yes, executed with precision, perhaps even tenderness. A death without blood, a concealment born not of greed, but of remorse. In that, Inspector, lies the most tragic kind of guilt, the guilt of those who love too deeply and too late." As the train drew to a halt, the chill of the morning seemed to settle upon us. Holmes stood by the open door, gazing down the length of the empty line. His face was pale, his expression unreadable. "It is a cruel thing, Watson," he said at last, "how love, once turned to fear, can so easily assume the guise of reason. Passion kills, but remorse buries. One woman envied, another pitied. Both were undone. We have proven the mechanism, but not the motive, and the motive, I fear, is written only in the heart." The first full train of the day thundered past us then, its wind scattering the mist like the remnants of a dream. I glanced once more at the carriage, quiet now, empty, save for the scent of lavender, and felt a strange heaviness that no triumph of logic could dispel. Holmes, already turning away, murmured without looking back, "The living deceive with words, Watson, the dead with silence, and the silence, as ever, proves the stronger." The fire had burned low in the grate, its glow softening the edges of Holmes's angular profile as he sat, motionless, in deep reflection. The clock had just struck 11 when Mrs. Hudson entered, her expression betraying more curiosity than alarm. "A gentleman to see you, sir," she announced quietly. "He seems unwell." Holmes glanced up. "At this hour, Mrs. Hudson, only conscience keeps company with insomnia. Show him in." The man who entered was scarcely recognizable as the proud Sir Henry Alcroft, who had first sought our aid. His face was drawn, his hair disordered, and his eyes bore that hollow glaze I had seen only in men haunted by deeds irretrievable. He clutched his gloves tightly, as though fearing to let them fall. "I beg your indulgence, Mr. Holmes," he began in a voice scarcely above a whisper. I could not rest until I had spoken freely. You have uncovered more than I deserve to have hidden. Holmes indicated a chair without rising. Pray, compose yourself, Sir Henry. It is not my habit to accuse without cause, nor to comfort without reason. Which of the two do you seek? The baronet gave a weary smile. Perhaps both. I did not kill her, Mr. Holmes. My hands are stained with cowardice, not blood. Holmes leaned forward slightly, his gaze fixed upon the man's trembling fingers. You speak of concealment, then. Continue. Sir Henry drew a breath, as though bracing himself against a tide long held back. When Lady Eveline vanished, I let the world believe it was mystery, not disgrace. I feared scandal more than grief, and so I hid what truth I knew. She fled, Mr. Holmes, fled not from cruelty, but from discovery. Holmes's eyes did not waver. And what precisely did she discover? The question struck him like a blow. He looked toward the fire, its light flickering upon his ashen features. A letter, he said hoarsely. An old letter I had thought destroyed, written 20 years ago, in the recklessness of youth. It was from a woman who bore my name for a day, and my betrayal for a lifetime. Lady Eveline found it among my papers. She said nothing at first, but I saw the change in her eyes. She left that night, taking nothing but the cloak I had given her when we were first betrothed. He fell silent. The ticking of the clock filled the pause like the slow pulse of reproach. Holmes spoke gently, almost kindly. And rather than confess, you allowed the world to believe her dead. I allowed it, said Sir Henry bitterly, for in her silence I found my punishment. I searched, of course, discreetly, hopelessly. When her glove was found in the carriage, I knew she had wished me to think her gone forever. And so I lived with that lie, as any man might live with a wound too deep to heal, pretending it no longer bled. I felt a pang of sympathy despite myself. The man before us was no villain, only a coward shaped by circumstance, one of those pitiable figures who choose silence where honesty might have redeemed them. Holmes's tone remained steady. And the widow, Mrs. Tarrant? A shadow crossed Sir Henry's face. She was the woman of that letter. She sought revenge, not justice. When Eveline confronted her, I believe, God forgive me, she found the means to turn my wife's mercy into despair. I see now that it was not I alone who buried the past. For a long moment, Holmes said nothing. The firelight flickered upon his sharp features, casting alternating light and shadow like judgment itself. Sir Henry, he said at last, you are guilty of pride, not of crime. The law may sleep content, but conscience, I fear, never does. The baronet bowed his head. Then let conscience have its way, Mr. Holmes. I am tired of concealment. Publish it, expose it. Do as you must. I am ready. Holmes's gaze softened. No, sir. Truth, once spoken, need not be paraded. The dead have their peace. The living must earn theirs. Sir Henry rose unsteadily, his hand upon the chair. Then I have your mercy, at least. You have none of mine, Holmes replied, his voice low but not unkind. Only your own, if you can summon it. He turned to the window, where the first light of dawn was just beginning to pale the eastern sky. The fire hissed softly behind us, and in that dim, growing light, Sir Henry Alcroft slipped away, a figure broken not by guilt, but by the long, slow burden of having loved imperfectly. For some minutes after Sir Henry's confession, there was no sound in the room save the faint ticking of the mantel clock and the sighing of the wind against the panes. Holmes stood with one hand upon the back of his chair, his gaze fixed upon the dying embers of the fire. Then, with a sudden movement, he turned toward me. Watson, said he, you recall Mrs. Tarrant of Guildford Street, the widow whose poise concealed bitterness more eloquent than words. Indeed, I replied. Her manner struck me as one of repressed malice, the kind that festers in solitude. Holmes inclined his head. Precisely. I have this evening received confirmation from Lestrade. It was she who orchestrated the deception, not for wealth, but for vengeance. When Lady Eveline discovered her husband's old scandal, she went to Mrs. Tarant for counsel, unaware that the wronged woman she sought was the very ghost from Sir Henry's past. The widow seized upon the chance that time had denied her. She arranged the meeting by the river, contrived the substitution upon the train, and ensured that the lady's disappearance would seem both tragic and inexplicable. Sir Henry covered his face with a trembling hand. Then it was her doing. All of it. Holmes's expression softened. Not wholly. The widow's heart was poisoned long ago, and the venom only needed air to breathe. She sought not your ruin, but your torment. It was envy, Sir Henry. Envy refined into art. Lady Eveline's death was but the instrument of a grief too long unspoken. He resumed his seat, the lamplight casting deep shadows upon his austere features. You see, Watson, there is no sharper blade than a woman's sense of injustice. It cuts with memory, not malice. At that moment, a sharp rap upon the door announced Lestrade. His face, as ever, bore the officious mixture of irritation and duty. "We have the woman under watch, Mr. Holmes," said he briskly. "Do we proceed with the warrant?" Holmes shook his head. "You will do nothing of the kind." Lestrade stared at him in astonishment. "But good heavens, man, she's confessed indeed, if not in word. Murder, abduction, destruction of evidence. This is not for pity to decide." Holmes regarded him coolly. "The law, Inspector, may punish action. It cannot measure motive. Mrs. Tarrant's guilt lies not in crime, but in the corrosion of the soul. To arrest her now would be to mock both justice and mercy. She has avenged herself more completely than the gallows could ever do." "But the dead woman," Lestrade protested. "Has already found her rest," Holmes interjected, "and the living must now seek theirs. I have no desire to see another life extinguished in the name of satisfaction. Let the widow keep her silence and her solitude. Time will pronounce a harsher sentence than any court." Lestrade, muttering, withdrew, defeated but not convinced. Holmes turned back toward the hearth. The clock upon the mantel struck midnight, each note falling like the tolling of a truth too long withheld. He spoke then, more to the flames than to us. "A vanished woman is never truly gone, Watson. She remains wherever truth has been hidden, and waits to be found. Sometimes she lingers in the whispers of those who wronged her, sometimes in the conscience of those who loved her. The world believes her buried, but she walks yet, in regret, in remembrance, in retribution." The fire burned low. Sir Henry rose, his movements slow, his eyes vacant of everything but exhaustion. "I shall not forget, Mr. Holmes," he murmured. "No punishment you could name would equal the weight I carry." When he had gone, I followed him with my gaze and saw, to my astonishment, a strange serenity upon his face, as though confession had granted him a reprieve that absolution never could. Holmes, watching the door close softly behind him, sighed. "There, Watson, goes a man not condemned by law but by conscience. And of all prisons," he added quietly, "that one has no walls and no release." The dawn broke pale and uncertain over the railway yard, its light struggling through a drifting fog that seemed to cling to every surface like memory itself. The rows of forgotten engines loomed in that half-world between night and morning, hulking shapes rimed with dew, their chimneys blackened, their windows blind. To one side, the disused carriages stood in a mournful procession, each an empty relic of vanished journeys. And among them, set apart as though shunned by its kind, was the compartment whose shadow had stretched across so many lives. Holmes and I moved in silence, our breath visible in the chill air. The ground was littered with cinders and the faint glisten of frost, the rails gleaming dully beneath the mist. A dog barked somewhere in the distance and was answered by nothing but its own echo. It was a scene of desolation, not of ruin, but of rest. Holmes paused before the carriage, his tall figure drawn in sharp relief against the thinning fog. He reached out a gloved hand and ran it slowly along the tarnished brass of the door handle. "Objects, Watson," he murmured. "Remember what men choose to forget." The words hung in the air like the condensation of breath upon glass. He walked slowly down the length of the train, his keen gaze sweeping over every mark, every dent, every faint trace left upon the wood and metal. The carriages bore no movement now, yet their very stillness seemed eloquent. I fancied I could almost hear the echo of their past. The hiss of steam, the cry of the guard, the faint laughter of unseen travellers long departed. "The world passes on," Holmes continued softly, "but the things it leaves behind are not mute. These walls have known fear, secrecy, remorse, and though they will rust and rot, the truth within them endures. One has only to listen." He stood for a long while, motionless save for the faint rise and fall of his shoulders. I could not tell whether he addressed me or himself, but his tone carried that quiet gravity I had come to recognize. The voice of a man in communion with something beyond mere deduction. As we stood amid the fog and silence, my thoughts turned to the three lives whose fates had converged within this narrow space. Lady Eveline, gentle and proud, whose courage had been undone by knowledge too cruel to bear. Sir Henry, whose fear of disgrace had made him prisoner to his own deceit. And Mrs. Tarant, the widow whose love had curdled into vengeance long before the act itself was conceived. Each had been drawn toward the same point by a different thread, pride, jealousy, or sorrow, and the strands, once knotted, could never be loosed. Holmes had often said that the heart was the most complex instrument in nature, more intricate than the human brain, because it defied reason while appearing to obey it. And as I watched him now, silent before that ghostly carriage, I thought I understood. Logic could unveil how a deed was done, but never why souls choose their ruin. At last, Holmes spoke again, his voice low but firm. "You see, Watson, the simplest of carriages may bear the heaviest of burdens, not of bodies, but of conscience. For truth, like steam, is not content to remain confined. Sooner or later, it finds escape, and when it does, it scalds all who stand too near." He turned away, and together we began the slow walk back across the yard. The fog was thickening now, curling around the iron wheels and creeping along the tracks until the world seemed suspended in grey. From somewhere far off came the long, mournful whistle of a train departing into unseen distance, that familiar sound of endings and beginnings intertwined. Holmes stopped once to glance back at the carriage, now half swallowed by the mist. "Come, Watson," he said quietly. "There is nothing more to be learned here. The rest belongs to time." We left the yard behind, our footsteps fading into the white stillness. As we reached the road, I looked once more over my shoulder and saw only fog, shifting and formless, where the carriage had stood. It struck me then that not all mysteries conclude. Some merely drift away, like breath upon cold air, unseen, unspoken, but never entirely gone. Holmes stood by the window, the fog pressing faintly against the glass, his silhouette framed by the dull glow of the fire. For a long while, neither of us spoke. Then he said, almost to himself, "There are crimes, Watson, that seek not gain, but remembrance. To such souls, exposure is a lesser fear than being forgotten. And so, they write their guilt into the world, upon carriages, letters, or the hearts of those they wrong." He turned then, a faint, knowing smile upon his lips. "Yet even the cleverest design, my dear fellow, cannot conceal the tremor of a human conscience. That is where truth always leaves its mark." I nodded, sensing the weary compassion behind his words. "Tell me, what do you believe was the fatal error in this deception? Was it the widow's envy, the husband's fear, or the simple persistence of truth itself?" Share your thoughts in the comments, and if you'd like to follow more of Holmes's remarkable deductions, don't forget to subscribe and share this story with those who enjoy a good mystery as much as you do.